All right. Today we're going to take a deep dive into a
Okay.
case that you sent over, and wow, it's a tough one. We're going to be looking into the life and crimes of Paul Runge, an American serial killer.
Mm-hmm.
And our mission today is to unpack what we can from the documents you've provided, including excerpts from Runge's Wikipedia page, and try to make sense of this disturbing story. He was convicted of killing at least 6 women and 1 girl,
Right.
but the true extent of his crimes may be even more horrifying.
It's a case that really makes you question how someone can live a seemingly normal life while harboring such darkness. Runge was married, held jobs,
Yeah.
and yet behind that facade, he was committing these meticulously planned, brutal murders.
And what's particularly unsettling is how he targeted his victims. He often pretended to be interested in properties they were selling, using that as a way to gain their trust. It's a chilling reminder of how vulnerable we can be in seemingly ordinary situations.
Exactly. He preyed on those vulnerabilities, turning everyday interactions into opportunities for violence. But to understand how he got to that point, I think it's essential to look at his early life.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. Runge grew up in Oak Forest, Illinois, and the sources indicate that he exhibited signs of what's called sexual sadism
Mm-hmm.
from a young age. Essentially, this means he found pleasure, especially sexual gratification, from inflicting pain
Right.
and humiliation on others.
That's right. And while it's crucial to avoid drawing a direct line between childhood behavior and later actions, it's a piece of the puzzle we can't ignore. This was further complicated by a traumatic event when he was 17, the death of his mother.
Yeah, that kind of loss at such a formative age can definitely have a profound impact.
Absolutely.
But tragically, it wasn't the only defining event of that year. He also committed his first known violent crime at 17, kidnapping, raping, and brutally beating a 14-year-old girl.
And what's particularly concerning is that he only served a portion of his 14-year sentence for that crime before being paroled. It raises the question, could his later atrocities have been prevented? This case really highlights the complexities of parole and rehabilitation, especially when dealing with violent offenders.
It's like his early release wasn't just a potential failure of the system, it was like opening a Pandora's box.
Yeah,
After getting out, Runge's crimes escalated dramatically. His first victim after parole was Stacy Frobel, an acquaintance of his wife.
and the details of this case are truly disturbing. He bludgeoned Frobel to death with a dumbbell in his Streamwood, Illinois, home,
Oh, wow.
and then dismembered her body in the bathtub. He scattered her remains across multiple states in a horrifying attempt to conceal his crime.
It seems like he was not only escalating in violence, but becoming more methodical in his approach. I'm curious, did investigators suspect Runge early on in Frobel's disappearance, or did she vanish without a trace?
Well, while the exact details of the initial investigation aren't fully clear in the sources, it seems Runge was on their radar. But tragically, before they could connect him to Frobel's murder, he had already claimed more victims. His next targets were the Poshimbigovich sisters, Bosnian refugees who had recently come to the U.S.
That's heartbreaking. They were simply trying to build a new life for themselves, and they fell prey to this predator. It seems like he specifically sought out women who might be more vulnerable, who might not raise immediate alarm bells if they went missing.
Absolutely. He lured them with the promise of a house cleaning job, exploiting their need for work and their unfamiliarity with the area. He then handcuffed them, tortured them, and
Wow.
ultimately strangled them to death. Just like Frobel, he dismembered their bodies, attempting to erase any trace of his horrific acts.
This is incredibly difficult to process, but it's important to understand the full scope of his crimes. It seems like a clear pattern was emerging. He used seemingly harmless situations, like the house cleaning job or expressing interest in a property someone was selling, to gain the trust of his victims before unleashing his violence.
That's a key insight here. This wasn't random, it was calculated. Each step was a manipulation designed to exploit a woman's trust and make her a more vulnerable target.
And this pattern continued with his next victim, Dorota Zubak, in January of 1997. She was a 30-year-old woman he met after responding to an ad she placed for a house sale.
Again, we see that same tactic of using a seemingly ordinary interaction as a way to access his victim. He raped and strangled Zubak before setting her home on fire.
The fire setting adds another layer of horror to these crimes. It's not just about the taking of a life, it's about obliterating any evidence, almost like he was trying to make these women disappear completely.
It speaks to a desire for control, for power, for dominance over his victims, even in death. And sadly, the fire was also a tactic he used in his next horrific act, the murder of Yolanda Gutierrez and her 10-year-old daughter, Jessica Muniz.
Their case is perhaps one of the most difficult to comprehend. He saw a for sale sign for some sports equipment at their apartment and used that as an excuse to gain entry. To think of the terror they must have felt being trapped with this monster, it's just unimaginable.
It's a stark reminder of the evil that can exist in the world and the vulnerability, especially of women and children, in seemingly safe spaces. Runge bound, raped, and tortured them for hours before cutting their throats and setting the apartment on fire.
I honestly don't know what to say. These details are just beyond words,
Yeah.
but we have to press on. His final known victim, murdered just a few weeks after Gutierrez and Muniz, was Casinera Peruque.
He targeted Peruque using the same tactic as with Dubach, expressing interest in buying her condo as a way to gain access. He raped and strangled her, and once again set her home on fire.
This pattern of deception, brutality, and attempted obliteration is truly chilling. He was meticulous in his approach, but thankfully, law enforcement was also becoming increasingly focused on his activities.
That's right. By this point, the FBI was already investigating Runge in connection with the disappearances of Stacy Frobel and the Pashambigovic sisters, suspecting a possible link. They were using every tool at their disposal: surveillance, wiretaps, even sifting through his garbage. In 1996, they conducted a search of his home and seized a mountain of evidence, including books about serial killers and various weapons.
It sounds like they were building a strong case against him, but they weren't quite there yet. What was the turning point that finally led to his capture?
Well, in 1997, he was arrested for violating his parole by possessing a weapon. That arrest proved to be a crucial break in the case, allowing investigators to keep him off the streets while they worked tirelessly to build an airtight case against him.
That's got to be a huge relief for investigators knowing they had him contained while they pieced together these horrific crimes. What were the challenges they faced in connecting him definitively to the murders before that arrest? Were there any missteps or missed opportunities that allowed him to continue his spree for so long?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
One we'll definitely explore as we continue to unpack this complex case. Runge's crimes spanned several years and crossed state lines, adding complexity to the investigation. But there's another element to this story, a scientific advancement that would ultimately prove to be Runge's undoing: DNA technology.
Okay, so DNA evidence played a pivotal role. That makes sense. This technology has revolutionized criminal investigations, but it wasn't always as readily available or reliable as it is today. Tell me more about how that factored into Runge's case.
Absolutely. We'll dive into the specifics of how DNA evidence cracked this case wide open when we return for part 2 of this deep dive. It's a fascinating and crucial element of the story that sheds light on both the evolution of forensic science and the relentless pursuit of justice.
All right, so we left off with Paul Rudge behind bars for a parole violation and the FBI hot on his trail. You mentioned that DNA evidence was the key to cracking the case.
Right.
Can you walk me through how that unfolded?
Absolutely. In the late 90s, DNA technology was still relatively new in criminal investigations, but it was advancing rapidly. While authorities were working to keep Runge contained under the Sexually Violent Persons Act, citing his prior rape conviction and lack of remorse, they were simultaneously running DNA tests on evidence collected from various crime scenes.
That's a smart move, using that time to build a rock-solid case against him. It makes you wonder how many cases went unsolved before DNA testing became commonplace. What were the biggest hurdles investigators faced before this technology was available?
Well, before, DNA investigators relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, circumstantial evidence,
Right.
and confessions. Those methods can be unreliable, and in cases like Runge's, where he went to great lengths to conceal his crimes, traditional forensic methods might not have been enough.
So DNA was a game conjurer for cases like this. When did the results come back and what did they reveal?
In 1999, the DNA test came back with a match linking Runge to the murders of Yolanda Gutierrez and Jessica Muniz. It was the undeniable proof they needed.
Wow.
It's hard to overstate how crucial this was. It was a slam dunk for the prosecution, taking away any possibility of Runge claiming innocence.
It must have been a huge victory for the investigators, but also bittersweet, knowing the horrifying truth behind that DNA match. How did Runge react when confronted with this irrefutable evidence?
Faced with the DNA results, Runge confessed to all 6 murders. It's a fascinating psychological aspect to consider. Some criminals maintain their innocence even when confronted with overwhelming evidence.
Yeah.
But others, like Runge, choose to confess.
I'm really curious about the psychology behind that. What do experts say motivates someone like Runge to confess after going to such lengths to hide his crimes?
There are a number of theories. For some, it might be a way to exert a degree of control over the narrative of their crimes. They might feel a compulsion to tell their story to shock and horrify. Others might be seeking attention or notoriety, craving the spotlight, even if it shines on their darkest deeds.
It's a disturbing thought, but it makes sense. He clearly wanted to be seen as this master manipulator, this cunning predator. Did his confession provide any new insights into his motives or methods?
While the specifics of his confession aren't fully detailed in the sources you provided,
Okay.
it seems he didn't offer much in the way of remorse or explanation. His focus remained on the calculated nature of his crimes, emphasizing his ability to outsmart the authorities for so long.
It's almost like he was proud of the terror he inflicted. It's chilling. You mentioned earlier that he attempted to escape custody. Can you tell me more about that incident?
Right, in 2000, while being transported to a court hearing, Runge, with the help of two other inmates, overpowered a corrections officer and made a break for it. Fortunately, they were quickly apprehended.
It sounds like a scene from a movie. What was his plan? Did he think he could actually get away?
The details of his escape plan aren't entirely clear, but it speaks to his desperation and his belief in his own cutting. Even while facing overwhelming evidence and multiple murder charges, he still believed he could outsmart the system.
This guy was clearly a danger to society, both inside and outside of prison. What happened next in terms of his trial and sentencing?
In 2006, Runge was convicted of the murders of Yolanda Gutierrez and Jessica Muniz, the case with the strongest DNA evidence. He was initially sentenced to death. The prosecutors at the time actually called him the face of the death penalty.
Wow, that's a strong statement. It sounds like they were hoping to make an example of him, especially given the debate surrounding the death penalty in Illinois at the time.
Exactly. There was a moratorium on executions in Illinois at the time, and Runge's case became a focal point in the debate. Those who supported the death penalty argued that cases like his demonstrated the need for capital punishment as a just response to horrific crimes.
But ultimately, that didn't play out as they had hoped. What happened with his sentence?
In 2011, Illinois abolished the death penalty under Governor Pat Quinn, and Runge's sentence was commuted to life in prison. This was a major development that reflects the ongoing national conversation about capital punishment.
It's certainly a complex issue with strong arguments on both sides, but in Runge's case, it meant he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Still, there's a lingering question. Could there be more victims out there? You mentioned earlier that authorities believe he might be responsible for other unsolved murders.
That's right. While he was convicted of 6 murders, he confessed to at least one more, the murder of a prostitute whose body he dismembered and disposed of. That confession, coupled with his methodical approach and the time frame of his crimes, has led investigators to believe he might be connected to other unsolved cases, particularly those involving women who vanished without a trace.
It's a chilling thought, the idea that the full extent of his depravity may never be known. Do the sources mention any specific cases that investigators are looking into? What are the challenges they face in connecting him to these cold cases?
While the documents you provided don't dive into specific unsolved cases, they highlight the difficulty of linking crimes that happened decades ago to a specific perpetrator. Evidence might be degraded or lost witnesses might be unavailable, and memories fade with time.
It's a race against time, trying to bring closure to these families while also gathering enough evidence to potentially charge him with additional crimes. It sounds like the investigation is far from over.
Exactly. Even though Runge is behind bars, the pursuit of justice for all his potential victims continues. And it raises some important questions about how we, as a society, deal with criminals like him. How do we balance the need for punishment with the possibility of rehabilitation? How do we prevent future tragedies while also ensuring that justice is served for past crimes?
These are tough questions, and there are no easy answers. But exploring cases like Runge's can help us understand the complexities of the criminal justice system and the lasting impact of these horrific crimes.
Absolutely. It's about more than just recounting the facts of a case. It's about grappling with the difficult questions and using these insights to hopefully create a safer and more just world.
It's mind-boggling to think that even with him behind bars, there might be families out there still searching for answers, still wondering what happened to their loved ones. It really underscores the ripple effect of these kinds of crimes.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that the impact of a crime extends far beyond the immediate victims. It touches families, communities, and even those involved in the investigation and prosecutions. These cases can leave scars that last for generations.
And you've mentioned several times that he targeted women in seemingly ordinary situations. It's terrifying to think that these everyday interactions could be manipulated by someone with such sinister intentions.
Right, and that's why this deep dive is so important. It's not about sensationalizing the crimes, but about raising awareness and understanding. His case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, especially for women. His calculated approach, using things like house viewings or even a for sale sign as a way to gain access to his victims, highlights the importance of being aware and trusting your instincts.
It's a delicate balance, though, right? We don't want to live in fear, constantly suspicious of everyone we encounter.
Absolutely. It's not about living in a state of paranoia, but about informed awareness. It's about being mindful of our surroundings, trusting our gut feelings, and taking sensible precautions. It's also about having open conversations with our loved ones about safety and personal boundaries.
That's so important. We need to create a culture where we feel empowered to speak up if something feels off, to set boundaries, and to look out for each other.
Exactly. It's about fostering a sense of community and collective responsibility. We can all play a role in creating a safer environment for ourselves and those around us.
This has been a really heavy conversation, but I think it's crucial to have these discussions. Before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to something you said earlier about the psychological factors that might contribute to someone becoming a serial killer. What insights can we glean from his case?
Well, it's important to remember that there's no single profile of a serial killer. They come from all walks of life, all backgrounds, and all socioeconomic levels. But there are often common threads: a history of trauma, a fascination with violence, a lack of empathy, and a distorted sense of power and control.
And in his case, we see evidence of many of those factors: the childhood trauma, the early signs of sadistic tendencies, the lack of remorse.
Exactly. But it's crucial to avoid making generalizations. Just because someone exhibits some of these traits doesn't mean they're destined to become a violent criminal. There are countless individuals who've experienced trauma or struggle with mental health issues who never harm anyone.
That's a really important point. It's about understanding these complexities without resorting to stereotypes or oversimplifications.
Right? It's about looking at the individual, their specific circumstances, and the unique set of factors that might have contributed to their actions. And it's about recognizing that while we might never fully understand what drives someone to commit such horrific acts, we can learn from these cases and work towards prevention.
So, what does all of this mean for us, the listeners? What can we take away from this deep dive into the disturbing world of Paul Runge?
I think it leaves us with a profound sense of the darkness that can exist in seemingly ordinary lives. His meticulously planned crimes, his complete disregard for human life, and the lasting impact on his victims and their families serve as a chilling reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of vigilance.
It's a reminder that evil can lurk in unexpected places and that we all have a responsibility to be aware, to protect ourselves and each other, and to work towards creating a world where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to occur.
And for you, the listener, I would pose this question: how can we balance the need for individual safety with the desire for a society that values trust and connection? It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's a conversation worth having.
It certainly is. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into this chilling case. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our world, but it also underscores the importance of understanding, justice, and the ongoing pursuit of a safer and more compassionate society.